thank you to our panelists. I will start our biodiversity panel right away. A very simple question. What is biodiversity and why are we talking about it here today? So Dr. Wood, if you could get us started.
Thank you so much. A simple way of asking what is biodiversity is counting the number of species in a certain location. But that is perhaps oversimplified. It also is asking what's the relationship among species, plants and animals and humans. I think we should consider humans as part of our definition of living things. And how are they exchanging value in terms of nutrients and resources in a way that brings life to an ecosystem? And often, in many ways that ecologists think about what happens in the natural environment, that exchange across ecosystems is rich and also has local benefits, but also global benefits in the way that that particular part of the world contributes to the health of our global environment. So part of the reason we're talking about it here in Panama and in Latin America is that biodiversity contributes well-being, both to the immediate plants and animals that are nearby and the humans, but often also at the global scale. And I think it's something that we can both add a bit to.
Yeah, totally. Good.
Josh, why are we talking about biodiversity?
Well, I think that was a great answer to that. I would only add that measuring biodiversity is tricky, and it's because it's expressed at different levels, and it's often quite local, and it's not distributed the same around the world. So we are interested in the diversity of genes, and we're interested in the diversity of species, and we're interested in the diversity of ecosystems, and the diversity of services those ecosystems provide to people. And those don't all layer up individually. And so when we think about biodiversity, it's an inherently more complex topic than, say, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. How much that parts per million that mixes uniformly. You can't do that with biodiversity, so it's a trickier problem, I think, and that is part of the why we're here, is to figure out how to get our hands around that problem, because we know of its importance, but we oftentimes have it's like grabbing Jell-O. It's hard to figure out exactly what it is for a lot of people and how to preserve it and how to measure it in the same way you do, say, carbon.
When you talk about why we want to measure biodiversity, of course, academics do want to spend time literally identifying new species and counting how many types of ants there are. That's a real need, partly for the sake of knowledge. However, there's also the question of what it means for our economy and for human well-being, and even for the well-being of just life itself. I also work a lot on space activity, so we're often asking, is there biodiversity beyond Earth? This is another motivating question. But in a very practical way, we could ask, how do we increase resilience because of biodiversity? How is there more likely to be a way to have a healthy ecosystem even when there's shifts in temperature, shifts in rainfall? For many ecosystems, the relationship between species helps to bring a way to avoid large-scale harms because of the presence of plants and animals interacting together.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, in some ways, I feel like, when we think about the value of biodiversity to people, we also think about the distribution of biodiversity. So, you go out here in the Panama Canal, you'll find an island the size of this compound. It'll have 4 times the number of trees on it than the entirety of Europe, for example. So it's super patchy in its distribution. And here we're in an incredibly biodiverse area, and a lot of times people don't understand, what do you make of that? What do you do with all that biodiversity? How does that actually benefit us? And I do think that when we step back and we ask the relationship between biodiversity and zoonotic disease, biodiversity and food production, biodiversity, and in a lot of our daily lives, it has a huge impact on how we live on this planet. I think we're going to get into that a little bit later, so I think we'll stop there and we can just dive through.
Hopefully we will get into all of this. I hope we have time to get into space biodiversity. I would love to get into that question. But since we set the scene, I will put a question to the audience now. We have a poll question that you can answer on your apps, as we've done in many other polls before. So, as a complex topic, many different parts here, how much of a role should the private sector play in protecting habitat and biodiversity? That is the question for you. Hopefully you can read that. It's pretty small print for me, but hopefully you can see it. And we'll get back to that further down in the discussion. While they think about that, Josh, can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned it in your opening statement, kind of measuring it, right? How do we measure biodiversity? Where are we in that process?
Yeah, I think measuring it, when we value things that we can measure inherently, right? And so part of the sort of, and if you just, even today and yesterday, you hear a lot of sort of targets that are climate related, and that measurement capacity on climate has had a lot to do with our capacity to sort of mobilize communities in the private sector, in the public sector, and civil society to really confront the climate crisis. The biodiversity crisis inherently is going to, in the long run, be much worse, even if we solve the climate crisis, and they're related, but it's harder to measure, right? It's harder to measure the explicit link, and sometimes I think, the difficulty in connecting a specific number in terms of number of trees and number of plants to a specific value it has to people creates the hesitation. But the best way I can think of the value of biodiversity is how you think of a portfolio effect. The biodiversity in a landscape provides the redundancy that allows a service to operate effectively. And in many cases, we're getting much better at understanding the economic value of preserving biodiversity. We often call these natural solutions or natural capital. It's not always the case that natural capital is more short-term efficient at solving a problem than human capital. But I can say that there isn't a design challenge we're working on today that hasn't been solved by some part of biodiversity. And so the latent sort of capacity of us to go into those systems and understand our own challenges and pull that out, we only have that if we have those systems intact to do that work. Oftentimes that's treated as an externality, and we don't incorporate that capacity to learn in our valuation of natural systems. And it's a hard one, but it's a systemic problem.
If I can, I'd just love to give an illustration that my team often works on. I lead a research team at MIT, and we're often invited by leaders at the city level, sometimes companies, sometimes governments, who are asking about how to think about the health of a coast. They're responding to ongoing climate impacts. They're noting either erosion or major storms or issues of actually land degradation. And then often we ask, can a set of mangrove trees planted on a coastline help? So they're increasing, in this case, both biodiversity and just the presence and long-term ability of these trees, both to help with carbon sequestration, but also to do very concrete things like help filter water, help provide a place for fish to grow, and help to provide a place sometimes for people to harvest firewood. And if you ask, can all these be services? We try to measure them. We do put numbers, and we try to estimate how much benefit do you get from the firewood and the fishing and from the loss, the protection of the coastline. But it's never quite exact, but I do think it's a good effort to at least make the list. What are the list of ways that these trees bring value?
Yeah, there's another example here, right here in Panama, I think is worth thinking about. And it's an illustration of the fact that you often don't have to measure all of biodiversity to incorporate the values of biodiversity in an economic model. In fact, it's almost always not necessary to get to measure at the really fine degree in order to preserve the value. So for example, Smithsonian here in Panama has been working for a decade to figure out how do you reforest the country, a region, with trees that'll actually provide value to landowners, with trees that'll actually absorb water and retain that water so that the Panama Canal will be able to function, because it's the trees on the landscape outside of the Panama Canal that soak up the water in the wet season and then let it trickle out in the dry season, allowing ships to pass at a normal depth level throughout the year. How do you do that and also measure the amount of carbon that's going in? And how do you do it in a way that you're not just planting teak everywhere, which doesn't grow very well, but instead planting native species and then building that out? We know all those answers, but I can't tell you how much biodiversity is in the forest at the end of the day, but I don't need to. Because if we do that replanting, we have this sort of triple bottom line effect. We benefit people on the ground, we benefit biodiversity, we benefit ecosystem services, which is the broad term for the water holding capacity of the landscape, without actually measuring all the aspects of biodiversity. I don't need to know how many butterflies are there. There are a lot of butterflies there. Yeah.
And Danielle, is there a downside to trying to put these numbers on everything, to measuring how many butterflies?
Thank you for asking that question, because certainly there's a tendency when we're doing business calculation and business forecasting to end up putting numbers on things and say, well, we'll make a decision that says if we find a positive net present value to conserving these mangrove trees or to this bird sanctuary, then we'll protect it. And if we find a negative one financially, then we won't protect it. And I think that's the wrong direction to go in decision support systems. If we're going to build a software tool to make an analysis, let's not leave it as a binary at the end that says we only want to invest in biodiversity if there's a clear profit margin in the short term. I think a broader thing is to discuss the fact that there's going to be a combination of traditionally measurable values, things that include like the ability to move boats through the Panama Canal, there's also going to be things that I would argue we probably shouldn't be measuring, such as the ceremonial or the cultural value of certain, whether it's a forest or a sanctuary for certain animals, because a certain culture holds value in that particular type of land or type of animal species. I think we should acknowledge that that's real and leave it as a qualitative description and not try to put a financial value on it. And then have that as really a mixed method. At the end, we're going to analyze both quantitative and qualitative discussions and hopefully have room for both in our discussions.
Yeah. Let me just give one more example of why measuring is, why understanding biodiversity I think is important. And it's a long-term investment issue. And we oftentimes fail to make these kind of investments. So, everyone's familiar with the sort of the fact that you'll have an insect outbreak somewhere in the world and wipe out a crop. And I can tell you that agricultural folks will tell you that every crop you plant in another region outside of its range will always have that happen to it. And we can predict with certainty that insect pests will catch up with crops. But we haven't actually invested in understanding the insects in their native habitat to know which pest will go where, when, and get out in front of that and stop it before it happens. The result are famines. The result are lives lost. But that kind of long-term investment is very hard to monetize. And it's probably best done by sort of a public sector approach, because it's hard to monetize that kind of space. But the value of understanding the biodiversity is still really important. We just don't know which part of that understanding is going to be critical next year or next decade. We can't predict that all the time.
I think what you're arguing for is that actually biodiversity is a public service. It's something that is diffuse benefit that goes to kind of all humans and next generations of humans.
Yeah.
And it's traditionally very difficult to value public services. Like, you could say the same thing about clean water and infrastructure. Maybe we can add biodiversity to one of the almost utilities, or the things we consider
it's a good utility.
A right to everyone to benefit from, but it will be very diffusely spread. But we know that when we take it away, the cost of replacing biodiversity versus the cost of maintaining it over generations, when you lose access to these clean water sources, or you lose access to the kinds of benefits you get from forests, replacing that is going to be either an emergency or a very expensive proposition.
That's right.
So before I get to our audience's answers for the poll question, how do you two see the poll question? Who's in charge? Is it the public sector? Is it private sector? Does it have to be a mix? Danielle?
I can just start by saying that I am optimistic. Being in this event with you all, I am seeing that the private sector has enthusiasm for being a positive player in society, when I think for maybe reasons that are both coming partly from pressure that is coming from consumers and from the broader marketplace of ideas, but also I think from internal desires. Employees at companies also want to be proud of their work. So one thing that's really exciting is that companies know that in their work of whether it's extractive industries or whether it's work that's doing manufacturing, there's going to be an economic and environmental impact. And there's a desire to be able to tell an excellent story about how that company being present in that location with impact on the land and the animals ultimately has a positive impact on the community. And many of you said that's why you're here. So I think there's an opportunity for public and private to come together and to create a positive cycle in which companies, yes, may need to deforest to build a factory, but then they're also reforesting later in cooperation with local indigenous communities. This can be a story that everyone can be proud of.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I feel like at this point, the private sector really has to get out in the lead, and I feel like that is happening, and it's not happening equally in all sectors, and it's not happening equally in all geographies. But I do feel like part of the work that's involved is understanding the investment opportunity. And I really feel like the enthusiasm there, but it's actually a little bit difficult to figure out what's a good thing to invest in. And I've heard that from folks in charge of ESG for portfolios. Like, how do I know that I'm having the big impact? And how do I be able to show that impact to my shareholders, to my customers, that I'm having that? And I think that's partially a conversation that needs to increase between organizations that are supporting the kind of projects that are required for the planet to be sustainable for our children, and the companies which want to be a part of that solution, but don't have to be the ones generating that on their own. It's a partnership. I feel like that partnership will go faster if it's done directly with the private sector, and I think policy will jump on that and run with it when the examples are shown and create the level playing field. I kind of feel like the private sector has the capacity to move faster, to move this forward more rapidly than the public sector.
And let me add one example of how the private sector is moving fast. I don't know if all of you are following the startup scene in the space community, but years ago, if you and I wanted to use an image of the satellite to track forest growth, which we often do, we would directly turn to government-owned and operated satellites. And this is wonderful because the government satellites are provided for free as public services. they have high science quality, and scientists who are paid by the government spend years just checking the errors in these data, and it's really beautiful and very useful, but it's also one particular version of satellite data. Right now, there are new companies emerging, some in the United States, but also coming from the Latin American region, that are asking, can they also contribute to the kinds of imagery of the Earth or measurements of gas emissions, for example, that can help us with tracking biodiversity with commercial satellite data and imagery. And this is adding new options.
No, totally. I was just going to riff off that, which is it goes back to the measurement issue. Like there's a program called TRACE, for example, which was launched a while ago to try and understand, take a product and figure out all the resources used to create that product, and then understand the impact of all those resources on the environment, right? Where does the metal come from? Where does the ink come from? Where does any part of that product come from? How is it extracted? If you can do that well, you can start to position responsibility appropriately on a marketplace and use that kind of accountability to not just, what we're talking about when we're saying that companies are moving fast, that's the front end, that's the early investors. The big worry in the war against biodiversity loss is it'll be the other end of the market. It'll be the market that is not going to be in this room thinking about how can I invest in ESG. It's the ones that'll come at the end. That's where the accountability is going to be critical. And that's where building that traceability and then supporting that as an industry standard will allow leaders to get credit for being leaders in that industry and pull that bottom 25%, which have 85% of the impact right now in the Brazilian Amazon, for example. That kind of traceability is critical. So which companies are doing it, which companies are leading, let's call that out and let's support those leaders so they can get credit for it.
I would like to tag on to that. You mentioned Brazilian Amazon. I'm Brazilian. There's a lot of debate about developing the Amazon. So I would like to ask you about how do you try at least to strike a balance between development and protecting biodiversity and making sure, you don't kill all the butterflies.
No. So, is it a balance? Does it have to be a balance? Does it have to be a tension either way, I guess is the first question I would ask, right? Because I do believe in the long run it's not. It's actually that our long-term growth, our long-term capacity to maintain a stable set of growth, a GDP that is going in a direction that helps development happen, is based on maintaining that environmental space. And I think that's particularly true in a country like, let's say, in Latin America. 25% of the GDP is based on direct connections with nature. That's not evenly distributed. So if you undercut that, you are undercutting a huge part of your economic base. No one in a leadership position would want to see GDP drop by 20%. It's just not viable, right? So the impact that the planet has on our ability to grow is exceptionally large and often underestimated within a local economy. And so on the course of a political cycle, maybe you can make short-term gains. Over the course of the development of a country, it's almost always that you're actually working in synergy, protecting and growing, not the other way around.
And a great example where there's been some measurable progress is the idea of fishery management. We've been talking about biodiversity on land, so let's also talk about our coasts and our oceans. So of course, we can highlight the importance of maintaining coral, for example, which again, that's a great obvious example. Everyone knows that divers want to come see healthy coral. Yeah. So there's a direct question of, yes, you'll have more tourism if you have healthy coral, but also not too much tourism and not too many ships coming in, because that also damages the coral. But the question of, as people are pursuing limits or kind of quota on how much you can do fishing, I think there's a general kind of easy concept that if you overfish and if you don't maintain areas for fish to reproduce, then you won't have a long-term ability to continue that market. So I think there is some conceptual idea that yes, we are maintaining biodiversity because it's actually good for us economically, rather than saying how much are we cutting ourselves economically with this biodiversity.
I don't think you can overemphasize that enough. If I was investing in fisheries, the first question I'd ask is, where's the nearest MPA, marine protected area? And if there wasn't one, I wouldn't invest. Because where do you think the fish come from? They come from those areas we're not fishing in. And so if you want a viable investment over the long term, look for the place that isn't fished, invest in fisheries near that. Because those are the ones that have a long-term trajectory of growth. And they won't deplete their resource. Right outside here, we now have a protected area the size of California, stretching from the Galapagos to the Cocos Islands. We're leaning in to figure out how to manage an area that size. We're leaning in to figure out how do you monitor the impacts of that. But I can tell you that bold political move will pay off for the 4 countries that made it. It will absolutely will put them in the front of the pack economically, not just in the front of the pack from the sort of an environmental perspective.
This is another great example of the type of area where we need both scientific progress as well as business innovation progress. It's one secret maybe we shouldn't spill, but it's actually that we are still learning in the scientific community actually how the fish are using the marine protected areas to spawn. There's lots of mysteries, which is great, that fish as they're going through life cycle have periods we can't observe them easily, which is good. I mean, we shouldn't be able to follow them all the time, but there's periods when they're happening deep in the ocean where they're mating, and we really, as scientists, are still asking fundamental questions. So while investing in this, it means investing in the science, investing in the protection, and investing in the next generation of fishery, plus having good yields right now.
And it's a super fun time to do it. I think we just had right out here is Koiba National Park. There's these big seamounts, and one of our scientists just dove to 300 meters and bumped into 100 sharks that are so rare we don't even know how rare they are. We haven't even counted enough to know. And so it's you don't know what you don't know, right? And so getting out there and exploring is a part of our job as scientists, and then collaborating to share that knowledge in a way that allows the private sector to use it in making sound business decisions is probably what science hasn't done enough of in the past. Absolutely needs to step forward in that space. Yeah, it's great.
I would like to just make sure we take a look at your poll answers.
Yeah.
So if we can pull that up. Wow. That is an overwhelming response. Thank you. So the private sector plays a big role. All right. One question I will take from the audience here before we wrap up with my final question. Excuse me. G20 countries should be leading the way and taking drastic steps, such as banning single-use plastic items. Is the private sector a stumbling block in this, or is it the governments?
I'll go back to the idea of what you mentioned, which is the ability to celebrate private sector entities that do a wonderful job in these areas. And I think for a while we'll probably see entities that kind of pick one theme and do really well, but we should celebrate that along the way. As another illustration, I also work on issues of the same kind of problem within space, where we've put a lot of space debris, physical trash from human satellites. And my team has been developing a rating system called the Space Sustainability Rating, but modeled on many other kind of Earth-based systems. And our goal basically is to first ask companies to voluntarily sign up to get rated, and then to celebrate. I mean, if you get onto a plane, as I'm flying here, many airlines have awards on the door. You can notice as you're boarding how many times were they celebrated for a particular positive action, whether it's for the way they treat their employees or the environment. So we want this biodiversity to become one of the things people ask. How's your company rated in biodiversity?
Right.
And it may take some practice. Often you first write practices down, and then later you gradually get more and more clear on how to implement them. But there's a way to make sure that we reward and celebrate, both in terms of reputation, but also in terms of investment, financing, customer loyalty. All those things can be features. And if we take a holistic view, I think progress can be made, that companies can get celebrated and see a positive return if they're doing this kind of work.
And I think we can get net zero beyond carbon. I mean, we've recently been involved in a project to say, what would that look like to have a process for understanding, rolling up individual contribution to a global goal like 2 degrees, for example. We know kind of how to do that and how to do the accounting for that for carbon. We're very far from understanding exactly how to do that roll-up accounting for biodiversity. It is a much harder goal. It is one we absolutely have to get to, because a North Star like 2 degrees is what is needed for corporates in the public sector as well to know where their part is. What does it mean to be doing my part for biodiversity? Most CFOs and most companies couldn't say. So we need to provide that transparency so that the people who want to be partners know how to be partners.
This is a business opportunity, because what companies can come and fill that gap in by offering the service of helping to both advise and then implement sort of convenient ways of taking metrics. I would ask companies, for example, that work in areas like shoes, well, do you know where their plantations are that grew the palm with the rubber for your shoes? And is that something you can easily look up? it wasn't convenient for them to look it up. The data had not been put into a nice dashboard for them. If they had that in front of them, they could actually ask, well, how are we impacting local communities by cutting down these forests and making palm plantations? But it's somewhere in their business process that they purchased from a rubber tree company, but they didn't have a direct line to that question. It's a part of their process is not to have that data in front of them. But there could be teams that kind of create a business service, especially if there was a marketplace saying, once you have this information in front of you, you can use it as investment plans. If that was normal, there'd be money made all around.
30 seconds on the clock. We're wrapping up. Josh, I want you to tell us what happens if we don't invest in biodiversity.
I think in the tropics, it's pretty scary, right? I mean, right now, Brazilian Amazon is on that teetering edge of deforestation between maintaining its capacity to absorb carbon, the largest single carbon sink in the world, and a capacity that not only starts to emit carbon at a net level, but actually starts a cycle where once you get to a certain point, you stop maintaining the atmosphere that rains down on the Amazon and keeps the rainforest intact, and you start moving from a rainforest to a savanna. That's called a tipping point. There is no company that can hedge against that tip. It will have a global impact on all industries if it were to happen. It is not just Brazil's responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen. It's all of our responsibilities to make sure that doesn't happen. And so in some ways, that's an existential threat beyond the sort of individual sectoral threats you might face by loss of biodiversity. That's the kind of threat that will happen if we don't pay attention. And it's not just in Brazil. When I said 25% of the GDP, per capita GDP, is based on linkage to nature, it's not evenly distributed. It's actually at the lower rung of all of those societies that depend on that. What happens when you cut out the lower rung of your society? Try to maintain a presidency or a government when your people don't believe in you anymore, when they don't have food to eat. It's absolutely a huge crisis to get underneath that and build out sustainable solutions today, and it's doable. But we can't wait until after we've solved the climate crisis. It's going to happen concurrently. It's right here. It's now.
All right. Scary
but
picture.
It's possible. It's possible. It's doable. It's a hopeful story, too.
But that's great. That's all the time we have, unfortunately. Thank you so much. Thank you both. This was a great discussion.
Thanks. All right.